Hi folks, it's Rob Flux here from Property Developer Network, coming to you for another Sunday session. This week we're talking about the economic and fiscal update that was released during the week by the Treasurer Josh Frydenberg and our federal Finance Minister Matthias Cormann. So I guess the good and the bad of the process, I'm going to go and try and debunk the announcements, give you a heads up as to what it actually means to you. And how that's going to break out in the upcoming future. Now, having said that, this is, I guess I want to announce firstly that for Brisbane, our monthly networking groups are now back face-to-face. We run these networking groups in Brisbane, Sydney, and Melbourne. So Brisbane, we are back, baby. So on the 15th of August, we will be doing this live and not via these Zoom sessions for our monthly networking events. Now, they are our regular meetups. That is the third Saturday of every month for Brisbane, but we equally have events for Sydney, which is on the fourth Saturday of the month, and Melbourne, which is on the first Saturday of the month. So for both Sydney and Melbourne, we will unfortunately be still running those monthly meetups via these Zoom session type events, but wherever we physically can, we're trying to be back in the real world. Not only that, but fortunately for us, it's actually also our 8th birthday. That's right, we've been running these meetup events for 8 years. We started all the way back in 2012. So if you have not yet joined and you would like to join our monthly meetups, no matter where you're located, the link is on the page below. So developernetwork.com.au/meetups, and what you can do there is follow the appropriate link depending upon the state you are located, and then come and join us. That said, got a little bit of a heavy topic today. So given the nature of the discussion, I have to declare that I don't have an AFSL license. I can't give you general or specific advice, and everything that I'm giving you is really intended for educational purposes only. So please make sure that you do whatever research you can for your own personal circumstances, and make sure you engage the appropriate professionals. Well, let's have a look at what's actually happening around the place, shall we? There is a bucket load of stuff happening. So let's have a look at, I guess, the coronavirus updates that are happening right here and now. So these are the daily confirmed cases Australia-wide. The light blue is Victoria, and as you can see, no surprise to anyone, but Victoria is, I guess, having some really challenging times at the moment with regards to the amount of outbreaks that they've got. It looked like at one stage those numbers were going down, but I guess numbers were up again yesterday. Unfortunately, there's a lot of outbreaks in aged care facilities, which means, I guess, some of our really, I guess, the most vulnerable people in our community are in grave danger, unfortunately. So hopefully with all of the wearing of masks, and hopefully with the lockdowns, they can bring that back under containment. But if we have a look at the size of this current outbreak for Victoria alone, it outweighs the original outbreak for the entire of Australia. Just to put this into an order of magnitude, if we start to look at Victoria from a breakdown perspective as to how and where the sources of infection are, red is local infections, whereas the light blue was overseas. And we can clearly see that it's now a community-based outbreak, meaning that it's actually, I guess, rampant within the community. And the only way we're actually going to contain it is by actually staying at home, folks. So for those of you in Victoria, these are the areas that the outbreaks are. The size of the circle is consistent with the number of infections that they've actually had in that area, to give you just an indication of how and where they are. And unfortunately, some of that has also broken out over the border into New South Wales. And we can also see where the hotspots in New South Wales are as well. And that's, I guess, at the moment under relative containment inside New South Wales, but I'm going to say watch this space. That said, that's not why we're here, but as an indirect result, It actually is. If we go back in time, and it's not that far ago that we actually had to go back in time for this particular announcement, Australian government on the 19th of September in 2019 actually announced that after 10 budget deficits in a row, that we were going to be back in the black, meaning that our budget was actually going to be in surplus. The amount of revenue being generated was going to outweigh the amount of debt and interest that we were going to be paying. And it's the first time in a very long time. Now, everyone poo-pooed them at the time and said, you know, that you're announcing it a little early, because they announced it at the start of the budget, that they would be in the black by the end of the that financial year. And I guess time is one of those funny things that when you look back retrospectively, I'm sure that they were quite regretting this particular announcement. However, what I would say is it's a really good indicator and a really good marker of what has happened since then, because it's a very clear line in the sand as to where we were going to be. Now, let's have a look at what Josh Frydenberg and Matthias Cormann announced on Thursday this week. So what they announced is our projected budget deficits. Remember, we were going to be in the black. Okay, so now our budget deficits, so for the end of this year, $85.8 billion in deficit is what is actually projected. And that's going to extend to a further $184.5 billion in deficit by the end of 2021. Now, having said that, I guess this is the reason why we're this far in debt. Obviously, the coronavirus pandemic has meant that the government has had to spend a bucket load of economic support. As a matter of fact, they have spent $289 billion in, I guess, direct measures and indirect measures with regards to stimulus packages and JobKeepers and job seekers and all sorts of things like that. So $289 billion. It's been that significant that they've actually had to announce that they've had to defer the budget. And the reason why they had to defer the budget is because things are changing that rapidly. It's actually hard for them to actually keep up with what's going on. So it was originally scheduled for May the 12th and has actually been deferred to the 6th of October. So this economic update was really trying to give us a little bit of an insight as to where we're at right now, given that the budget hasn't been released. And it's also a way of the government softening the blow for what I think is going to be a really nasty budget coming up. And so it was their way of kind of leaking out some of the information a little bit slowly over that time. Now, some of the things to be cognizant of are the unemployment rates, which I'm going to go into in a little bit more detail, and what they've spoken about with regards to the unemployment rates and how quickly they've escalated, and also how fast the I guess the opposite direction has gone with regards to sorry, having a brain fade here, with regards to having a brain fade. That's okay. Luckily for me, I can twiddle my thumbs and I'll work it out. So let me move on to the next point, and no doubt it'll actually come back. So one of the things that they're looking at right now with regards to that upcoming budget is trying to give us a little bit of time to stabilize in what's happening in and around the pandemic, hoping that the Victoria and New South Wales outbreaks can actually be contained. And then they've got a little bit more predictability as to what they can actually do with the budget. So right now, they're really hypothesizing in a whole range of things that are quite uncertain at this point in time. So some of those uncertainties, okay? So Victoria currently in lockdown at the moment, they're only budgeted for the fact that they're locked down for 6 weeks. And they've based that on the fact that that is the current decision of the Victorian government right this very moment. So it's very hard for us to project what the Victorian government may do, so they've only budgeted for what has been done. Okay, there's also New South Wales outbreaks. Well, we don't know whether or not that's going to result in lockdowns in New South Wales. we don't know if the Victorian lockdowns are going to be extended. So those things are quite unknown at this point in time. State borders at the moment are largely opened up. Queensland is being quite stringent in who they're letting in, but mostly open, but very selective in declaring some people are locked out. Similarly for South Australia, they're largely letting most people in, but being selective in who they're locking out. And at the moment, our international borders are locked down, so we don't know how long they're going to actually remain locked down. So right now, these budget projections are based on a few things that are a little bit rubbery. So, and the government knows that they're a little bit rubbery, and I think what they're trying to do is really set the scene for us to brace ourselves. Now, what they have said is given us some hints on some of the things that are going to come in that budget when it comes out in October. So some of the things that they are talking about, they have rejected what is called austerity, and I will talk a little bit about austerity a little bit later. And instead, they want to grow the economy. The way that they want to get out of this particular situation is by growing, not shrinking the amount of spending. And what they've said is that there are a number of initiatives that they're going to be doing in the upcoming budget, such as reducing red tape to make it much easier to do business inside of Australia. And they're also looking at lowering tax and a number of other things. That said, one of them that was a one-liner that I picked up was that when Josh Frydenberg was talking to the National Press Club on Friday, that one of the red tape reductions he was looking at was planning and zoning reforms. Now, us in the property world should be paying very close attention to that when the budget comes out in October. And what I suspect that they're going to try and do is start to standardise on some of the planning and zoning around Australia. Hoping, fingers crossed, because right now every single jurisdiction is very different in how you actually get to do business. So different zone names in every single state, different density requirements for the same zone name, even within the same state, just when you go from council to council. So hoping that they put a lot of effort into cleaning that up. Not sure that in the limited timeline that's going to happen, but I know that something is going to happen in and around that space. Some of the things that they have been talking about is they were emphasizing the unemployment rate, and I will go into unemployment rate in a little bit more detail as we go through here. From a GDP, gross domestic product perspective, in the very dark blue line is what has been reality. And in the light blue line is what they projected would have actually happened had the fiscal support not actually been in place. So had they not spent that $280 billion in support, our GDP would have fallen through the floor. And instead, whilst it has fallen, they're projecting that it's going to recover. Now, they're still projecting a V-shaped recovery. So V is straight down and then relatively straight back up. Whereas if we have a number of these outbreaks, we have to lock down again, it's probably going to be more of a W, up and down, up and down, up and down. So right now they're still projecting a very V-type recovery. So once we've had a little bit of time to get to October and we've been able to stabilize things, hopefully we can have a little bit more insight into what's actually going to happen there. Now, one of the things that I want to highlight, and if we have a look at how much money we've spent, and I'm going to go back a couple of slides just to remind you, 85.8 billion this financial year and 184.5 billion in deficit by the end of next financial year. I want you to memorize those two numbers as I talk to you about this slide. The global financial crisis, as by way of comparison as to our last recession, at that point, we were only $52 billion in deficit. So note, we are currently much larger and we're about to be 3 and a bit times, almost 4 times larger than that particular recession, okay? And that's the most recent. So that was 4% of the GDP at the time. Now, why is that relevant? Well, this is going to play out over the next couple of slides, okay? It's taken us more than 10 years after that GFC to return the annual budget back to balance. Now, that is the announcement that the government made that we are back in the black. So that announcement took 10 years to get to the point of us being able to get to that point. And once we're in the black, then we were going to start paying back the original 52 billion. So remember, we were just about to hit the point where we're about to pay back that 52. We've not yet paid any of it back, and we've just added another 180 odd billion on top of that. That's really critical to note, folks, because that's going to add significantly to our debt levels. So all of this time, the economy was growing, but underneath the economy growing, the debt levels were also growing. So we were catching the debt levels, but we didn't actually get to the point of surplus. Now that plays out in this next slide here. Now, I understand that on your screens, this is going to be a little bit hard to read. It's really the blue line that we're looking at. So this blue line here is actually the net debt. And you see that the net debt has been climbing. And right now, we're just under the $400 billion mark in actual debt. And the pink is the net debt as a percentage of GDP. And you'll see here, we have just gotten the pink to be underneath the blue line. So we've just gotten to the point where, hey, our debt levels are able to start being repaid back. And in the meantime, we've climbed almost to 400 odd billion. And now we're going to add another 180 billion on top of that, right? And again, we're going to start to go backwards. So let's have a look at this in a very different way, okay? So, and apologies for the fact that this is a little bit fuzzy. Unfortunately, this was the only source I could actually grab this graph from. So the dark blue are, I guess, the payments, as in the money that the government is actually spending, so expenses from the government, and the receipts is income from the government, meaning income from taxes. And right at this point at crossover here, that's where we were actually back in the black. And look how short a timeline we were actually in the black. And what is projected here, that massive differential right here, is just for that first year. Remember, that's only 84 odd thousand, and we're 84 billion, I should say, and we're about to go to 180 odd billion. So we're talking big numbers, and it's going to take us a very long time to start to pay this debt back. And the government has given us this information in a softly approach, trying to, I guess, brace us for what is going to happen in the October budget. So what that looks like from an interest perspective. So when we actually look at the amount of interest, we're very fortunate that right now interest globally is actually, international debt is actually quite low. So our 5-year money market, if we want to borrow money internationally for a 5-year period, it's 0.4% interest rate. If we're going to borrow it for 10 years, then it's a 0.9% interest rate. So right now, when we're borrowing all this money, whilst it is quite a large amount of money, it is at a very low interest rate. And what that actually means is about $16.3 billion in interest alone in order to be paying this debt back. That's a lot just in interest. If you've got an investment property and you're doing, I guess, 16.3 billion, then you'd have a very large portfolio. But just to give you some insights, folks, we're very fortunate that right now those interest rates are so low. It took us 10 years to get to the point of catching up to that 54K and bringing us back in surplus. I predict it's going to take us much longer to actually get back to the point where we can start paying our debt levels back. Now, how do we get out of debt? Well, there's only really 3 options for us to consider in how to get out of debt. So I'm going to walk you through what those 3 options are. So first one is to spend our way out of it. Okay, so effectively, if we can stimulate the economy, then we can actually grow our way out of the debt. Okay, so the whole concept here is if people are spending, then businesses are growing. If businesses are growing, people are employed. If people are employed, then they are able to pay taxes. If they're able to pay taxes, then the debt levels actually get back. So that said, this is the chosen path that the Morrison government has taken to date. Next one is crunch government spending, or what is called austerity. Okay, so what this is the exact opposite of way number one, and that is to just cut expenditure. Now, that's how they attempted to get out of the Great Recession, the Great Depression, I should say. And unfortunately, that didn't work. It actually kept them in that depression for much longer. When they've looked back over time, it kept them back in there much longer than they could have otherwise gotten out if they actually tried to stimulate the economy. So the Morrison government has said very clearly and very succinctly that austerity is not on the table. So the third way to get out of debt is to raise government revenue, i.e. tax. Okay. Now there are three levels of tax that I guess largely apply in Australia. So there's income tax, there's corporate tax, and there's GST. Now raising income and corporate tax is extremely unlikely, especially given the Morrison government has spent so much effort in the last several years trying to lower the company tax rate. And the reason why they're trying to lower the company tax rate is that we are very uncompetitive globally with regards to how much tax we actually charge our businesses. Equally, we're very high and uncompetitive with regards to income tax, although there's been no discussions about trying to drop our income tax rates of any significance of late. But I don't see either of those as being on the table for changes. The last tax, though, GST, this is, I guess, a likely alternative, okay, is to either raise the level of GST, as in the interest rate, or broaden the GST so that it actually applies to more items, because right now there are a number of items that are actually exempt, okay? Now, economists have been arguing for years that this is something that's needed within Australia, largely because by international standards, we're actually quite low with regards to our GST rates. And so I'm going to say that that now is probably a time where it's actually going to open up a narrative that opens up a debate to say, is it time to do that? Okay. So we've got things like the New South Wales government wanting to reduce things like stamp duty and that sort of thing inside their government. With regards to that, they want to compensate that by raising the GST levels. So this is really, I guess, I think an open loop that right this point in time, people are not really wanting to discuss. But if I'm going to do any crystal balling, I'm going to say watch this space specifically for GST announcements and discussions. I think the time between now and October, I think raising the GST might be on the cards. Now, I don't think that either side of government wants to really do that, but I don't know that they've got much choice. So I think it's going to be a combination of way number one and way number three. That said, as I said, the Morrison government has chosen way number one to spend our way out. And the reason why they've done that is a thing that underneath is called supply side economics. So supply side economics basically works on the assumption that by growing the economy, okay, they can do that by effectively lowering taxes and decreasing regulation. So it stimulates the fact that stuff actually happens. When they start to stimulate the stuff actually happens, then at that point, consumers will start to benefit with greater supply of goods and services that are supplied at lower prices. And because of that, because people have a consumption mentality, that will start to consume more. That will then increase employment because people will need to have jobs in order to actually create the goods that are being consumed. And then when people have jobs, the fact that they actually have a job means that they actually have a revenue, which means that they have the ability to be taxed, and the ability to be taxed then gives them the ability to repay the debt. So it's a chicken and egg type situation where have to go into debt to stimulate the economy, and then once the economy is stimulated, we can get the debt back. So that's called supply side economics, I should say, and that's really the presumption that the Morrison government is working under at this point in time. Now, Unemployment rate. I might just take a little bit of a sip. There's been a great deal of discussion about unemployment rates of late, and right now, where this dotted line is, the official unemployment rate is around the 7.4% mark. And you can see that the light blue mark is where they projected it would have been if they didn't put all this stimulus into the economy, if they didn't spend that $289 billion. And so what they're projecting is that our unemployment rate is going to grow significantly. They're projecting that's going to get somewhere around the 9.25% mark by December, and then hopefully start to taper off at that point in time. Now, having said that, it is the official unemployment rate. And I'm going to come back to the official unemployment rate in a couple of secs, okay? Now, the reason for me saying the official unemployment rate is this blue line is the official unemployment rate. The red line represents underemployment. So underemployment are people that still have a job, but they have been kept in that job by things like, I guess, the JobKeeper package, for example, where they may be working less hours than they were before, but they are still technically employed, okay? And when you combine those two together, that's the green line, and that is what is called the underutilization rate. Now, this right now, you've seen that there's been a little bit of a drop off in these two. That's because of the fact that the lockdowns started to be effective. We got the virus under wraps. Then we opened everything back up. People started getting employed again. And so you see a little bit of a drop off. Then, unfortunately, Victoria had a second outbreak. So I'm projecting that it's then going to go up again. Now, the reason why I'm projecting it, I'll go into in a little bit more detail. And some of you have seen me explain that before, but this will make a little bit more sense pretty soon. Having said that, the unemployment rate really is looking at what they call prime age workers, which is in the 25 to 55 year mark. So if we have a look back over time, I guess from a global recession point of view, you know, we're around the 3.5% unemployment rate. At the 1990s recession that we had to have, we're up around the 4% mark, and the GFC, we're around the 3% mark. Whereas right here, this is us right now, we're at 7.4% right now. So we are massively high in comparison to all of those other recessionary type events. Now, what is really, really, really scary is the fact that that number right now is not the actual number. That is, for reporting purposes, got a massive lag on it. And this is the timeline that's actually released by the Australian Bureau of Statistics that actually shows how and when our job rates and unemployment rates are actually captured. And you'll see here the June stats were captured all the way back in between May 31st to the 13th of June. So there was a 2-week period where those figures were actually captured, and then they were released on the 16th of July. So you can see there's a massive lag between those two, and that massive lag is approximately a month or so that has not yet been reported on. And within that month, I guess we've had the second outbreak with Melbourne. So I think we're going to see the figures go down for June. So we're actually in the middle right now. We're actually capturing the July figures right here, right now. But again, that's only at the start of when Melbourne went into lockdown. So by the time we actually get the figures for what's actually happening right here, right now, I think will be 2 months from today, which is going to be really scary when we actually get to that point in time. If we have a look at historical episodes of unemployment, what we can see here, and remember those figures were way, way lower. Down the bottom is a timeline. So this is 5-year mark and this is 10-year mark. Many of these depressions have taken between 5 and 10 years to actually recover. 1970s recession, taken a long time to get that unemployment back under wraps. And so what has happened in a very, very short period of time with the pandemic actually took quite some time in the 80s, 90s, Great Depression and everything, actually took a long time to play out and then a long time to come back. And what I'm concerned at is that our unemployment rate is going to be that high for a massive period of time. Now, if you remember that graph that I spoke to before about the unemployment rate and then the underemployment rate, well, it's actually getting to the point where the government actually recognizes that the underemployment is massive and significant, and that the lag in reporting is also so significant. So they have started changing their languaging, and this is really critical to actually start to note. So they've started languaging what is called the effective unemployment rate. And so moving forward, you're going to start to see a little bit more statistics on the effective unemployment rate to give you a little bit more insight as to what's actually happening. And right this very moment, off the top of my head, I think the effective unemployment rate is about 13.4%. But please, that's off the top of my head. I don't have that number handy. So what the effective unemployment rate includes is the unemployed, obviously, the underemployed, people who are marginally attached. So people who are hanging on by the skin of their teeth because of the fact that they've got things like JobKeeper and that sort of thing, keeping them actually in place. And what they say are discouraged workers. So people who have basically just given up looking. So they've gotten to the point where they became unemployed. They wanted to go into the workforce. They tried a few things, and then they just went, well, what's the point? And they've actually given up. So those discouraged workers are right now not being counted. So when we start to add those in, that graph that I was referring to before starts to become a little bit more of reality. But now you're going to start to see that effective unemployment rate reported a lot more consistently. So right here, right now, again, apologize that it's a little bit fuzzy, but the effective unemployment rate has gone up massively. I don't know off the top of my head exactly where that, it's 14 and a bit % from memory, and they're projecting it's actually, sorry, this is it here, I should say, so 11 and a bit %, I should say, but it's going to shoot up again. And eventually the unemployment rate and the effective unemployment rate will then start to merge back together as the economy starts to recover and people get back into the workforce. As people are less discouraged and actually get into the workforce, as JobKeeper gets weaned off, all those sorts of things, those numbers will start to come together. So you're going to start to see this effective unemployment rate, I guess, discussed a lot more moving forward. Now, with regards to JobKeeper, some recent updates with regards to JobKeeper. So under the current scheme, everybody knows that the payment has been $1,500 per person per fortnight. That was a flat rate regardless of your employee, how many hours you worked or anything like that. Under the new extended scheme, they're basically going to start to wean us off JobKeeper. They want to encourage us to get back into the workforce. And because some people are actually earning more money on JobKeeper than they were actually being employed, so they're discouraged to actually go and look. So they've got a tapered system. So between Monday, the 28th of September and Sunday, the 3rd of January, so this first range, they're going to drop that down to $1,200 a fortnight if you're on the full rate, or $750 if you're on the partial rate. And then come January 4th, they're going to drop that down to $1,000 per fortnight for the full rate and $650 per fortnight for, I guess, the partial rate. There's also going to be some categories of employees. So this wasn't categorized before very clearly. So under the current scheme, there was no real distinction between full-time and part-time work, all that sort of stuff. So what they've done is distinguish that to say, well, there are people who are going to be eligible for the full rate if they were full-time employees, and the partial rate if they were part-time employees. And there's also a matrix to say, well, are you actually an employee or a business participant? So without going through I guess the intricacies of that, letting you know that there is a two-tiered system based, again, and that two-tiered system will be tapered over time. So when you look at the permutations of that, so if we, for example, if you're eligible for the full rate right now, that means that you're working more than 20 hours in the business on average per week, then you would actually right now receive 1,200. In January, then you would receive 1,000. If on the other hand, if you're the partial rate, then you get 750 per fortnight right now and 650 per fortnight as it's tapered off later on. So that's a very high level overview of how that's actually going to work. Now, with all of this going on, the amount of unemployment has been massive. And what that has meant is that the ability for people to actually pay their mortgages has been very challenging. And there have been in excess of 800,000 mortgages that were distressed and were requested to actually have a mortgage moratorium. Now, originally, that was a 6-month mortgage moratorium that has now been extended for another 4 months. And so that's actually going to now expire somewhere around the January mark at this point in time. So as I said, 800,000 loans are currently under distress, and that equates to about $260 billion worth of loans right now that are currently not being repaid. Now, what the most recent updates have said is that some of those loans, about 10% of those loans, are now starting to eke back into being repaid, but there's still a long way to go. And I think given that our economy is in such poor shape, I think that there may even be a further extension come January, but it's really hard to tell at this point in time because we're so far out. It's really going to depend on whether or not we can contain the current outbreak and whether or not the economy does start to kickstart again. Now, job creation is clearly the main priority for the government. As I said, they're very much on that supply economics, supply side economics, so spending money and in order to create jobs. Okay, so I've shown this particular set of slides previously a couple of times, but it is just announcement after announcement of infrastructure jobs being done. So $223 million on the 21st of June, 35 million on the 22nd of June, 415 million on the 22nd of June, 53 million, 145 million, 46 million, $1 billion worth of infrastructure projects. So this is the government spending big on projects that they know, infrastructure projects, so building roads, building airports, tunnels, all those sorts of things that require jobs. Okay, now they're going to be some ramp up time for the companies to be shovel ready in order for that to happen, but the government has committed those funds. Now, many of those projects the government had already budgeted, but it might have been 2, 3, 5 years down the track. What they've said is, let's bring that forward right now, because we need people out there in the economy actually doing stuff. If they're out there doing stuff, earning money, that means that they can go out in the economy and spend money. If they're spending money, that means that the businesses that they're spending money in can also afford to employ people. And the more people that are employed, both directly and indirectly, means the more taxes being raised. More taxes being raised means that more ability for that debt to actually get paid back. Okay, so that's really the concept and the process that they're doing right here, right now. That said, there is another incentive called Job Trainer that has been announced, which is a $2 billion package. Details of this are, I guess, a little light on at this point in time, but what I do know is it's broken up into 2 different tranches of money. So $500 million of that is direct training subsidies. So if you go and wanting to do a retraining course because you've been made unemployed in one sector and you want to get re-employed in another sector and you want to get retrained in order to do that, then there's some subsidies to actually help you along that way. And the remaining $1.5 billion, they're going to announce a little bit later in how they're going to spend that, but sorry, the detail on how they're going to spend it, but it's going to be incentives on creating apprenticeships and giving incentives to employers to actually bring apprentices on, because they know that, I guess, the younger workforce right now, the way that the economy's been shut down, the younger workforce are the ones that are actually getting really disadvantaged the most, because they tend to be more casual in nature. So what they're trying to say is, well, let's try and look after those guys, because they are our future. And let's set them up so they've actually got a career, and I guess long-term sustainable. And no doubt, because I guess it's in that tradie type sector, they are going to be employed by the people who are actually creating, actually constructing all of these infrastructure projects that are actually being rolled out. So that said, my predictions for the next little while, whoa, I don't really want to bank on a lot of this, but there's going to be, the budget has clearly been delayed from May until the 6th of October. I'm seeing that what is going to go into that budget is going to be a whole bunch of further expenditure and further job creation type activities. There's going to also be a whole bunch of cutting of red tape. So I know there'll be a lot of things where, you know, the ability to do business with government in many sectors right now is very challenging. They'll be looking to do a lot of stuff with regards to cutting red tape. And the one that I picked up on with regards to what Josh Frydenberg said at the National Press Club was changes to zoning regulations and development approval processes. I see that what they're trying to do is actually make sure that that being able to actually create a development and do a development is able to be fast-tracked. He made some comments about one jurisdiction alone, and he said if they could free up the process just in New South Wales, they could create an additional $1 billion per year worth of stimulus just in Sydney. Don't worry about the rest of New South Wales, just in Sydney. And then if you do that across the board Australia-wide, imagine how many jobs that's actually going to create, especially given that the construction industry is, when you add up all the different sectors within the construction industry, that it's technically the largest employer in Australia. So I see lots of opportunities happening there. I see that the property markets, they are softening, have been softening for quite some time. And I guess it's been slowly, and people being very hesitant. Unfortunately, I think it's inevitable that they are going to drop. It's been deferred somewhat by the fact that people are keeping their JobKeeper. It's been deferred somewhat by the fact that the mortgage moratoriums have been extended. But once we get to December, January timeline, and the JobKeeper starts to wean off, and the mortgage moratoriums get either turned off or reconsidered about extensions again, at that point, I think it's inevitable that our property prices are going to drop. And so, you know, prepare yourselves, folks. Make sure that you can actually afford to ride that particular wave out. And I'm also calling a watch this space for the conversation about increasing the GST to start to come to the fore. Okay, now whether they actually make changes to GST or not, I think the conversation is then actually gonna start. Both sides of politics are going to talk about it, because the door has to be open for some sort of tax reform. And I think that will then have some flow-on effects with, well, if we increase it in one area, we might have to turn off a tax or two, such as stamp duties, etc., in order to even out the playing field. But we're then going to spread the love across all of Australians rather than just, you know, one particular industry sector, for example. So that's kind of my predictions for the next little while, folks. So that said, reminder that I do these Sunday sessions every single Sunday at 5 p.m. Brisbane time, which means if you're in other parts of Australia, you just need to adjust your time clock for that. Especially in and around daylight saving times, which we're not in right now. Reminder also that we also run a couple of Facebook groups. So our Facebook groups are Property Developer Network, and we have one called Development Site Deal Hub. So make sure you jump onto those communities, always active. We also run those monthly meetup groups, and I don't have the link to that right here, right now, but it's developernetwork.com.au/meetups. And you can then follow the appropriate link for your particular jurisdiction. So that said, folks, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to jump over and see whether or not we've actually got any questions from you guys, and no doubt there will be plenty of them. So let me just kind of whiz over and see what's happening there, and let's see if I can make that so I can actually see the questions go whizzing past. Okay. So there's a whole bunch of people talking, but most of them saying hello. Let me see if I can give me 2 secs while I have a look at this. A lot of people saying great session, thank you, no problem at all. Just trying to see what questions we've got. So Rachel says, can you go back to the page that shows the new JobKeeper rates? My snipper tool broke at that precise moment. Rachel, no, I'm not going to, and not because I don't mean to, but because you can actually just replay the video at the end of this. So you'll be able to play that over and over and over. That, and so both on Facebook, and we also upload that to our YouTube channel. So you generally will have it on YouTube in a day or two. Not trying to be mean, but I guess just trying to move on with the show. So who else has got some questions? Michael says, lies, damn lies and statistics. Definition of unemployment is soft and misleading at best. Michael, that's kind of the point, which is why they're starting to talk about the effective unemployment rate. I have touched on previously the fact that the definition of unemployment is somewhat rubbery. So that's probably the most politically correct way of saying that. And so the government is now changing their languaging to say the effective unemployment rate so that we can have a little bit more reality as to what's actually happening. So I tend to agree with you with regards to that definition, mate. Sam says 60% of our Commonwealth debt is owed by offshore investors. And there's a link. Okay, thanks for that, Sam. I will more than happily go and have a look at that link later on, and see if there's anything that we can actually report back to you guys in regards to that. What else have we got? A lot of people just commenting on lithium exporting, well, lithium batteries and electric cars. I'm actually, one more prediction that I would like to see, and I'm not sure if this is actually going to make it, but what I would actually like to see is the government actually start to look at investing in renewable resources and creating whole new industries that we currently just don't have in Australia, or if we do have, they're very minuscule, getting us back to leading edge technologies again. That's one that I'd like to see, and that's primarily come because Philip said, talking about exporting lithium. And I guess we're crazy at the moment exporting our primary resources. Our resources industry is what's actually propping us up, but what we're actually doing is we're exporting our resources for someone else to add value, and then we then buy that added value back in the form of cars and knickknacks and that sort of thing. So our manufacturing industry has been decimated over the last 30 or 50 years, to the point where it's almost non-existent. And we're giving this stuff away to everyone else to then sell it back to us at a premium. So Rachel has just commented on what productivity does Australia have? The answer is we don't, Rachel. So we do, but not much. For some reason, the mint has to be repaid. I have no idea why. I'm not sure what that comment is regards to, Rachel. So K Wong says, why do we /Australia borrow money from, so why do we borrow money from Rob? I wish you could borrow that much money from me. I wish I had that much. I wonder which country has this much money to lend to us. Actually, that's not quite how it works. And it's probably an entire presentation in itself as to how money is actually created. We run what is called the fiat money system. And so money isn't quite money. So it's more currency. That's a whole can of worms in and of itself. But if you want to, I guess, do some Google researching on the difference between, I guess, money and currency and the fiat money system, I could go on for about an hour as to what that means. Rachel says, with 16.3 billion of interest per annum, there's no way it'll ever get repaid. I disagree, Rachel. It will get repaid. It'll just take a long time, a little bit like the last recession. We need to have governments, and I'd say governments, because it's going to go through many iterations of not just the current government, but the next one and the one after that, to be fiscally aware, to not keep adding to the debt, and instead be very conscious of trying to actually get that debt repaid and actually bring it back under control. So right now, the amount of debt that we've got is growing. Now, by comparison to a number of other countries, we're relatively low with the amount of debt, but it can get out of hand very fast if not appropriately managed. So, and then Rachel has then got a question, why don't they just print the money? And the answer is, Rachel, they do. That's how they created it. Hence my previous conversation with Kay Wong as to the fiat money system. Do some homework on that. They effectively do print more money. There are two tranches of the government. I guess I'm having a brain fade. The RBA and then the actual government themselves, and the two work independent of each other but in cahoots with each other, and one just prints money and the other one then borrows it from there, and then they have some I guess back-end arrangements as to how that's actually done. Lefty says, what do they classify as too small? Not really sure what that comment's in reference to, Lefty. So it looks like there's a couple of conversations that are happening in and between each other. Okay, so there's some backwards and forwards between some people. I'll just skip those because it doesn't look like a question for me. Tarek has got a question. What is the percentage of the deficit with respect to GDP? At this moment in time, and I do have that slide handy, I think. Let me see if I can just find that very quickly. It's not one I memorized, to be honest, but I think that's in the vicinity of 20-odd% at the moment with regards to the debt with regards to GDP. So it is quite high. So we need to actually get that very, very low. So our net debt as a percentage of GDP is about the 20% mark. So I think, okay. Luke says, will Queensland capitalise due to recession and more affordability? I think right now, Luke, there's opportunity for Queensland to capitalise in a whole bunch of fronts. So we've seen things like all the sporting codes move up here. All of our borders are open. We seem to have nice weather. A lot of people want to come here. But at the same time, I don't think we've got all the infrastructure capable of actually taking that on. But who knows? But I think absolutely Queensland will suffer less than the other states as a byproduct of that. Felicity says, although today's numbers were higher, they were also doing more than double the number of tests from the day before, so didn't go up too much comparatively. Felicity, I'm not going to agree with that statement. Yeah, I guess a positive case is a positive case. The fact that they're doing more tests is really just meaning that a lot of them aren't getting away with not being captured. So yeah, I'm just going to take that at face value. A lot of people saying hi, and that's the end of the questions. So there you go, folks. Big session today. Hope you got plenty out of it. As I can't see any more questions coming through, I'm going to say thank you very much for participating. As always, I run these Sunday sessions every Sunday at 5 or 95% of the time. So I look forward to catching you at the next one. And also make sure that you come to our meetups, folks. So we run regular monthly meetups for Brisbane, Sydney, and Melbourne, and wanting to expand that a little bit further into other jurisdictions as well. So come and join our community, join our Facebook groups, actually get involved, not only learn about what's happening in the economy, but also what to do in and around your property growth, and also what you can learn in and around property development, so you can actually learn how to accelerate your wealth irrespective of what the market's doing. Because whilst I've painted a picture of doom and gloom here, there are absolutely opportunities that are presenting themselves for those who are educated. Reason why I do these announcements is to give you some insights and education so you can make informed decisions for yourself. So that said, folks, it is goodbye from me, and I look forward to seeing you next week. Bye for now.